Let's take a look at Adobe Illustrator, a great drawing program that we're going to use for a number of things in our projects. And first of all, you might say, what's the deal with Adobe Illustrator? Why do I need another drawing program? And let me show you an image here that hopefully will describe what I'm talking about. Adobe Illustrator is what's called a vector drawing program. And basically what this means is that lines are defined by itty-bitty little computer algorithms, a little bit of mathematical formulas, which means they can be scaled infinitely. So you can make a tiny little sketch on your phone, and it can be blown up to 100 feet square. Whereas when you paint with pixels or draw with pixels, and this is what you get when you draw with Photoshop, or when you just take a photo and post it to Instagram, is you end up with pixels, which means you can't blow it up. You end up with dots, and that's actually called pixelation. Sometimes you like this, and it kind of smooths things out, but in general, it's best to draw with vectors if you can. You can't always do that. So let's take a look at the Adobe Illustrator interface first. And a couple of basic features. First of all, I've loaded into this drawing a couple of drawings from AutoCAD. Actually, this is just an AutoCAD elevation, boring old AutoCAD. There's a number of things you can do. You can select objects that were drawn in AutoCAD, but you can do things like change the color of the lines. See how if I click on that, they all turn black. And you can change their line weight, even if you just choose a different number here. And you can choose pieces individually. And you can paint. There's a paint bucket. And of course, we all love the paint bucket. And there are all the millions and myriad of colors that are available. Whoops. In all of our software. So, and that's just an AutoCAD drawing, and we can even extract AutoCAD drawings from our Revit files or SketchUp files. So if you like the look of an Adobe Illustrator drawing, and I'll just show you here, this is a floor plan, and it's got all those fun things that we like, drop shadows and squiggly lines, or you can go with that more watercolory effect. These are very easy to achieve in Illustrator, and to change if you decide you don't like that, or if you want a more detailed rendering later on. So for example, this elevation over here, I'm using a photograph, and I can use a photographic person as opposed to the gray silhouette person. And all these elements can be modified in different ways. Illustrator is not the end-all of everything, but it absolutely has a lot of nice features that we'll take a look at. So let's learn a few of the tools. If you are playing along at home and you're saying, I'm never going to remember what all those buttons mean, I have posted this Illustrator Basic Tools diagram. It does have the keyboard shortcuts here, so if you look and you're the kind of person who likes optimal efficiency, learn these tools, especially if you use it a lot. Really, we only need a few tools for what we're doing. But I'll go through and kind of show you some of the basics. First of all, the interface for Illustrator should look pretty similar to some of our other drawing programs. There's a whole bunch of tools here, tool buttons on the toolbar. There's kind of a menu up top that sort of shows the active tool and some options for that tool, kind of a control panel there. There are pull-down menus that you can choose and find basically all of the tools that are available in these buttons. They're available here in different ways. And there's plenty more actually hidden under here. In fact, there's a whole list of advanced menus that have great features. If you're into that kind of thing, if you want to trace images from the internet and use them as patterns in your project or whatever. Anyway, also like a lot of our other programs, there is kind of a properties menu. So if you select an object, there are often properties that show up. These are the menu is much more graphical than say AutoCAD or Revit. but it's pretty clear. Anyway, the thing that we use very frequently are these kind of palettes here. These palettes are really handy. Now, if you're not seeing these palettes, by the way, and it does vary from Mac to PC and also the version, what palettes are visible. I'm using this workspace called Essentials Classic. If you're using, I don't know, the painting palette, I'll just switch to that. See how some of the things are the same, but some are actually different. This has layers and brushes and a color guide and all this stuff. Again, a lot of these things are kind of up to you as to how you're going to use it. So I'm going to use the Essentials Classic because I believe that's the default value that we get, and makes it easier to collaborate when we're all working on different systems. Anyway, there's a number of different things that we'll look at. There's a color guide. There's kind of swatches, which you can take a look at. These are colors that you can fill objects with. There are all sorts of cool line weights or line types. I'm sorry. And even symbols that you can use that are ready-made. You can also control what's called the stroke. The stroke is essentially the line weight. So if I draw an object, let's say, here's a box, the black is the stroke and the yellow is the fill. And you can even see here under the Properties menu, it's got a button for the fill, and I can actually just click on this and change the color. Okay, I can also change the stroke. The stroke can have a color. Again, you can match it, or you can go with something opposite. And I can change the line weight of these objects. And basically, this is how Illustrator works. You draw objects, typically known as paths, using various tools, and then you modify them in any number of ways. Again, I'll make my way down here. There's a gradient panel that we'll look at. A transparency panel for some fancy effects, and a few others that we probably may not get to for something as basic as this. Down here, what you'll see is there's actually layers in Adobe Illustrator. For my project, you're not really going to use a lot of layers, but if you do render floor plans, and there's a separate video for floor plan and elevation rendering, you do end up using layers quite a bit. So anyway, and then there's this whole export of assets, which if you collaborate with other people, that's a handy dandy thing. Okay, well enough for those. Let's actually get into the bread and butter here and start drawing some objects. So first of all, when I drew your most basic objects, there's a number of tools, just zoom in on this part of the screen, that we tend to use. There's a pen, and a curvature tool, which is basically a pen that draws curvy things. There's this line segment tool, which you can probably guess draws a line segment. And then there's a rectangle tool, a paintbrush tool, and a pencil tool. Now, in reality, you can probably get away with the pen tool for most things. In fact, I'm a little fuzzy on exactly what the difference is. Some of these tools have options that you can double click on, so you can make the pen, for example, more accurate, which means more squiggly, or smooth. And any number of different things that it can do. Paintbrush is the same way. You can control it, whereas I believe the main pen, there are no options. Okay, so with the pen, if you just click and start drawing, it will draw whatever you draw, and it will even fill it in if you complete the drawing. If you click and drag with the pen, you get curvy lines. If I just click, I get straight lines. So using the pen, you can draw a combination of curves and straight lines. Now, you might say, well, that's all fine and dandy. What if I just want to draw curves? I can use the curvature tool, and then as you draw, I'm just clicking. I'm not clicking and dragging. It will fill in an object for me. And again, it uses the current fill color. This is the stroke color, okay? And you can choose those down here in the toolbar, or you can choose those here. So before you start drawing, I'll just deselect everything using my selection tool, and I can pick a new color for the stroke and the fill. I don't know why I'm choosing that color. And now any new object will take those objects. And what's really interesting is that you can select an object using the selection tool. Just click off of it, and in the menu for picking fill and stroke, you can choose this box with a red slash. That is the none option, and that basically removes the fill. I can also remove the stroke. And now you might say, well, what good is that? It's not really very good. But sometimes you end up with an instance where you do have these kind of invisible objects that are used in creation of other objects, either by adding or subtracting. So those are your basic tools. Line segment does exactly what you think it would do, which is either click and drag to draw a straight line, or just click once. Click once, and it will bring up a menu that allows you to enter a dimension and an angle. Okay. Oh, except I'm drawing everything invisible. That's kind of silly, isn't it? Here, let's give everything a nice, healthy black stroke, and we'll give it a nice green fill color. Okay. Rectangle tool kind of works in the same way. You click the rectangle tool. If you click and drag, it will draw a shape. If you just click, it will bring up an option, and you can type in some number. Okay. Once you've entered this object, by the way, you'll see that there are little grips here in the corners. Those grips, excuse me, when I use the the selection tool, I can edit those grips in any number of ways to change the shape. Okay, moving either the edge or the point. It typically will just be a free transformation, which is to say I can make this a square or not. If you hold down the Shift key, it will lock the proportions of whatever shape that you had when you started, before you did this transform. There are also these very interesting little grips here in the corner, transform handles, that allow you to curve the shape. Okay, and you can change that curvature at any time. Okay. Now, you might say, why are there two selection tools? And that is a very good question. The other selection tool is called the direct selection tool. What that allows you to do, if you have a complex shape, let me just zoom in on this. By the way, zooming in can be accomplished in a number of ways, but I prefer the Command or Control plus and minus, just because it allows me to use my hand that I'm not using the mouse with. Anyway, this direct selection tool allows you to grab individual anchor points in a complex shape. So for example, this shape here, and maybe I should change the stroke color to something a little lighter so that you can see my handles. This direct selection tool allows you to grab these individual handles. This includes what are called Bezier handles. These are how, this is kind of the algorithm that Illustrator uses to figure out curves. So again, there's an anchor point, and then there's these kind of Bezier adjusters. So that's the direct selection tool. And there's a number of different ways that you can use that, including if you're using an AutoCAD drawing, you can come in and grab individual pieces of the AutoCAD drawing and change, say, a line weight around the window or a wall base. So drawing a rectangle is all fine and dandy, but what if we want to draw some other shape? A lot of these tools that you'll see here have tools hidden underneath, which you can access by clicking and dragging on that tiny little downward right-facing arrow. So I clicked and dragged on the rectangle tool, and you can see there are a number of handy tools. The polygon tool is an awfully handy one. I'll show you that one. With that, like with other tools, you can click once, and it will offer you an option of how many sides do you want, and is there some radial dimension. And you can just type that in, and it will draw it. Oh, that's a pretty big rectangle or a polygon there. You can also, with the tool, just click and drag, and sort of like Revit or AutoCAD, the shape will adjust as you move your mouse. And of course, once you've drawn it, there are all sorts of options that you can do to rotate it and move it around. So each of these tools does have things hiding underneath it. But again, most of the things that you're going to want to do can be accomplished using the paintbrush, the pen tool, the curvature tool. The paintbrush tool works very similarly. You click and drag in a regular path. It does not fill it in. If I select this, you can see there's no fill pattern. I believe that's so you can create sort of more linear effects. For example, if you wanted to paint, I don't know, a background to have a nice soft feel to it or something like that. Anyway, there is also, interesting enough, an eraser tool that doesn't always do what you think it will do. You might say, well, that's going to erase an entire object, isn't it, or part of it. And it does. You see how I can kind of erase these elements. However, if I erase this object, what it does is it actually changes that path so that it erases the little segment I drew over and will stretch the boundary in the direction of mine. So there are a few more drawing tools we can look at. One of them is a fun one. It's called the gradient tool. And the way it works, I'll go over here to the gradient panel. And basically you can kind of drag different gradients, different types of gradients, onto the object that you have selected. Or you can just pick them here out of the menu. You see how I'm drawing on the foreground color. I could change the angle, reverse it. I could even use the gradient tool here to drop in a line which can be modified in different ways to kind of stretch out the gradient graphically if you prefer. And add interior elements to it. In fact, you can even drag a gradient onto a line. So you can see how I can have my line. Let me just get rid of that. My line can fade away, again, just by toggling the front and the fill and the stroke color. You can kind of change the way they work. And of course, there are other options for each one of these. So gradient is an awful lot of fun, and I use that sometimes to create these downlight kind of effects by creating a gradient that toggles between basically solid color and zero opacity. See how I can change the opacity. If I were to change that to be some different color, for example, you can see how it would change from 100% blue to 100% green. But if I just change the opacity here down to 0, it will ignore that color. There's a slight blend. But now, one thing I haven't talked about yet is what if you're just not happy with the colors or the stroke types that are available in your project? Well, there are certain options. So far, I've just been drawing normal uniform lines. There are other kinds of lines, and changing these line options, you can see you can get some irregular qualities to the lines. I don't always like the way these look, but I guess they're trying to make them look hand-drawn. There are a number of different line types that are available here under the Brushes palette. And all you have to do is just click on the line type and or click OK, and drag it onto your object here, and it will change the stroke to have that line type. And each of these has its own kind of characteristic. Maybe I'll turn off the fill color for right now. Oh, I guess I have to select this first, huh? Turn off the fill color. So, you can decide if you like these. If you're just not so excited by some of the standard line types that show up, you can go to down on the lower right of your brushes library. There is a whole library of additional brushes. Let's just go with some artistic brushes here. Let's take a look at some ink ones. And I'll expand this palette here a little bit. There are quite a few different options here. Not everybody likes these. Again, it's a very stylistic sort of thing. But if you want to try them out, just click and drag them onto your drawing. What you'll see is that they show up now here in your sort of in-model brushes palette. And then you can continue to modify them. So for example, as you double click on it, you can make some further modifications. That gets pretty deep into it. Let's just say that there are quite a few different options here. And if I click on these down arrows, sorry, left and right arrows, on my brushes library, you'll see that there are quite a few different ones. And again, are these right for your particular design? You'll have to really kind of take a look as you go. Some of my favorites are these watercolor ones. I like the way these look in rendered floor plans. Have a very sort of soft effect. Kind of gets rid of some of the harshness of computer drawings. So anyway, those are different line options, stroke options, and again, I'm just going to go and choose the basic one, which is the way. Oops, I have to select this first. Go and choose the basic one, which is what everything comes in the default color. And you can do the same when it comes to swatches. So right now, there's no color in here, and again, I can. Well, first of all, let's make this a larger thumbnail here so we can see what we're doing. I can drag a color in, sorry, double click on it and grab it. I can change the opacity, but I don't always like to do that because it modifies the line weight as well. So if I'm doing that, probably is better to go and actually start to modify the color itself. There is an effect when you add black to a color that it's kind of changing the hue or the tint, I guess. Here, let's see. I can get this. See how that adds a darker color. You can also add essentially white to the color to kind of lighten it up. And that's kind of the hue, I believe. And so there are a great number of ways that you can change the colors. And of course, like we saw with the stroke, there are all sorts of libraries here. Let's just take a look at some gradients here, maybe some fades. This is a nice one to use. And what we can use for this one, I'm going to make a copy of this object by selecting it, copying it, and then paste it right in place on top of the original. And then I can color it with some kind of fade. And this is a way to achieve kind of a gradient without using the gradient tool. Sometimes you get a little bit more control, especially if you want your fade to be something like a pattern. So anyway, that is a terrific way to generate some interesting colors. One other funky drawing tool that's kind of unique is this symbol sprayer tool. If I click on that tool, depending on which symbol is the current symbol here, I'll pick the splatter, and the size of the drawing, it will basically create these fun little splatters. And you can make all sorts of symbols and create your own and that sort of thing, but that's just a fun one that's a unique thing to do. All right. So those are the basic drawing tools, and of course there are plenty of others that we're not going to cover. There are also some editing tools. Some of them are going to be fairly familiar. If you select an object and, for example, you click the rotate tool, what you'll see, let me just zoom in on this, there's a little dot that is the center of the rotation command. I can click to place that wherever I want, and now when I click and drag, the rotation dot shows up somewhere else. And again, you can click to place it, rotate the tool. The scale tool also works in a similar way. You click the scale tool, and there is a scale dot around which the object will scale. Okay, again, if I just click, place that dot wherever I want, it will scale in that direction. Okay. And like with other tools, there are others hiding under here. Some fun things that you can do. Again, most of these tools, like this is the reflect tool, it's kind of like the mirror tool. Most of these tools, again, you can probably, might be more sophisticated for the types of drawings that we're going to be doing, since we'll be doing basically simple shapes. Now, there are a few funky features about rotate and these other commands. If you want to rotate some object, for example, you can also double-click on the rotate command to specify a certain amount. You can also click the copy button, which will make a copy at that specified angle. The other fun thing that you can do, we had our rotation center here. If you hold down the Alt button or Control on a PC and click and drag, it will make a copy of that object. Very similar to in SketchUp, where and in Revit as well, where you can click and drag on an element, and when holding down the correct key, it makes a copy. The cool thing is if you type Command or Control D, it will make a new copy exactly the same distance and angle as the original one. So you can create straight or rectilinear arrays this way. There are a number of other editing tools which can be accessed in this context menu. They're generally under this transform subgrouping here, and they consist of move, rotate, reflect, scale, and shear. These are tools which are available as buttons. Obviously, move, pretty straightforward, except that when you use this particular option, you can type in a number. Vertical numbers, by the way, are backwards from the way you think. So if you type in -1, it will go up 1. See how the object started here and it has moved up here? That's because I have the preview menu clicked. And like before, you can change the angle just by clicking and dragging. Also, if you click the copy button, it will make a copy in that direction. And this is when you can use that Command D option to continue making copies in that same direction. And most of the other transform tools kind of work the same way. You know, if you use rotate, it brings up the rotate menu, reflect, scale. Shear is one we haven't looked at. But you can kind of get a preview of the angles that the object gets sheared at. It can kind of be stretched in different ways. This is one, it kind of produces unpredictable results, but it can also be fun. So click OK. Here, I'll make a copy of this guy again, and I'll use my scale tool, transform, scale, and I'll make it a little smaller, maybe 50%. Okay, and if we have the preview option, it'll be visible. And I'll show you one last tool which is awfully fun for editing, which is what's called the blend tool. And you can select a couple of objects. Oops, I'll just hold down Shift to select these two objects. And when you click the blend tool, double click on the blend tool, you can tell it any number of ways to combine these two objects. And what we'll do, it can either have a smooth color, a specified distance, or specified number of steps. But now that I have done that, I can click on the two objects in my selection set that I want to have a gradient of varied shapes. And you see how it makes up the difference by slowly adjusting the shape to be a smaller shape. So that's a fun editing tool. Another fun editing tool that you can use, and again, always unclear, you know, how many situations you'll need this, but the Puppet Warp tool is a fun one. What you can do is you can kind of click on a shape and add kind of these hinge points, and then as you click and drag on the hinge points, you can kind of bend the object, and I find that it's fun. You know, I kind of wish I could animate this, you know, and make it into different things. And it has this really cool Voronoi style pattern that shows up when you do it. But anyway, that is a wonderful editing tool, which I like to use when I'm just creating kind of blobby shapes where I'm not exactly sure where I want them to go. So there you go. Now I have my new shape. Okay, so we've finally figured out how to use all these different tools. What are we going to use them for? Well, let's make a new drawing. Just go to File, New, or Command N. And we're going to make our pattern. And basically, when you're making a new document, I go with the Print presets. There are a number of different ones: tabloid, letter. You can also type in a value. If you look on the right here, Illustrator, unfortunately, it likes to use points as its default value. You can choose inches. I think that's probably more familiar to us. I'm just going to make a 12 by 12 board here. Now, these are called artboards when you have a blank Illustrator file. And you can actually have a number of different artboards in a file. And this makes it really handy. Let's say you're working on 3 or 4 different interior elevations, or floor plan and reflected ceiling plan at the same time. You can have an artboard for each, and they can be inserted into something like InDesign independently. Anyway, I'll just create a blank file. Now you could draw in this blank area really anything you want, and then create a pattern out of it. I'm going to start actually with a blank pattern. I find that that's a little easier. And what you do is you go to the Object pull-down menu, choose, and down towards the bottom, there's a number of things that you can do with different objects, but these are where most of the tools are for editing. I'm just going to make a blank pattern, and Adobe gives me this little warning message that a new pattern has been added to the Swatches panel. If you look over here in the Swatches panel, there's a blank white square. That's my pattern. I'm going to just tell it. You don't have to tell me that every time. And I can make this new pattern. First of all, I can call it anything I want. You know, Brody's dog. If I want, I can excuse me, make the pattern size any dimension I want. You see how as I type in these dimensions, this blue box, just going to zoom in on that, that size of that changes as I type in a new value. And 4x4 is a good point. For our online printing fabric process to work, we do need a square shape. So 4x4 is fine. And this can be scaled to any size, so don't worry if that's too small or too big. Anyway, I leave these 2 boxes unchecked. The size tile to art, the blue thing is the tile, and the move tile with art, what that will do is any object you draw, it will center them in the pattern. So anyway, what you can do here, you can draw basically any shape you want here. I'll put in some circles. If I say draw a circle, what it will do, it will create a tile pattern, a copy of this tile over across my screen. And this is why I did a 12 by 12, so I could kind of see a full repetition of the pattern. And this object you can, like we saw before, we can create a stroke or a fill color of any option that we prefer. And really, what's nice about this is you can make changes to this object quite easily see how they're going to be affecting the entire pattern. So for example, if I make a copy and I drag it over here, now I have a 2-dot kind of pattern. Now, what about if there are overlaps on the edges? Well, what happens, I'm going to hold down Alt and make a copy up here at the top. And what you'll see is that see how it makes a copy at the bottom as well? But I can't select that. The originals here are what are highlighted. And in fact, I sometimes turn down the copy's opacity so that they're easier to see, although then I like to turn them back up again so that I can see the effect that they have. Anyway, so you can really kind of use this view as a design. I'm just using the arrow keys to nudge these objects and come up with a pattern that you like. And again, as you cross over the edge of the pattern, you see how it starts to overlap on the right here, the copies. So it's a really nice way to see your project. And I'll leave it up to you to come up with a drawing that you like. But I will tell you that, first of all, you can draw any object that you want. Sometimes what people like to do is have a background pattern. So for example, if I drew a rectangle, a rectangle from one corner to the opposite, well, first of all, I'm not going to use any line stroke on that, and I think the color, let's go with just a, I don't know, a gray or something like that. I could use that as a background for my pattern, and you see how it starts to create a background that will be repeated. The tricky bit with this is that it does cut off the repeat pattern. So if you absolutely must have this background color, I'll show you what to do. First of all, I'm going to change that color to be, let's go with a pattern, maybe some basic textures here. Oh, I don't know, we'll go with some dots, something like that. And I'll make sure that there's no stroke so that I don't see that repeat. But now, as you can see, I'm still getting some blocking of this this object, and the way that you can get rid of that is you basically have to select the object that's giving you the problem and copy it over to this side of the pattern. And this is, again, only if you have some background that's blocking things out. So again, I'm going to go to Transform, Move, and I know that it is 4 inches over, 0 vertical, so it makes it exactly 0. I'm not going to transform the pattern, but what I am going to do is make a copy. So now I have 2 of those objects here, and I can do the same thing vertically with these objects. I can transform them, move. Now I'm going to go 0 horizontal. Interesting enough, you'd think it would be negative, but it's actually positive. See how it makes a copy going down. So click copy, and like magic, our pattern is complete. Okay, you may get a warning message about some of the active content when I use symbols and repeated copies like that. So there is my lovely pattern. And one thing to note about these patterns that's a little funny is that they do tend to stay put when you move your shape. I'll show you later how to fix that. But again, as your designs progress, you'll decide what you want to do. Obviously, you can have linear elements too as you go. Just all depending on what kind of design you want to create. What's nice, again, just see what you think about your view. If you wanted to trace over a photograph, you can use the File, Place option, and go find a trace here. I'll use my vector versus raster image. Just click and drag the image into your drawing area, and you can trace over that with other lines, or you could just leave it in there if you really wanted. Again, just being aware that this is an opaque object, so it will overlap with any spots that are part of the repeat pattern that cross over the edge of the tile boundary. So that is kind of how you create your pattern. When you're done, just click. So you might say, hey, where did my pattern go? Didn't I so have a just draw a pattern? It is here in your swatches menu. I'm just going to draw a couple of rectangles to create little swatches for printing of my project. I'm just going to use the rectangle tool and click once so that I can make a 4-inch by 4-inch swatch. That's kind of the size that I drew the original pattern at. That's what you should use. And I'll just apply my pattern here. And I'll make a couple of copies of this swatch, this box, just by selecting the objects and holding down Alt or Control on a PC to make some copies. Now, you might say, how am I going to recolor this object to get my different color ways, which are basically variations on a theme? Well, Illustrator offers you a couple of really easy ways to do this. I'm going to move this out of the way so we can see this one as we modify the menu. But the easiest way to recolor a pattern is to click the Recolor Artwork button here when you select an object. And what it will do is it'll bring up a menu. with any kind of color groups loaded in. And you can see how when I click on that group, it gives me a preview of what those objects would look like if I recolored them. Right now there are only two groups in here, or I guess grays is one of them, and brights is another. So I could easily recolor this one as brights, and I could go and select this other one and recolor it as grays, or vice versa, excuse me. Okay, you know, that's fine. But what if I want some more colors? Well, one thing that you'll see is that in our swatches menu, like our pen stroke menu, there are different kinds of patterns out there. There's whole libraries. So for example, if you wanted, let's see, if we go with kind of colors that are based on you know, our color theory, we could go with a split complementary, and it will bring up a menu, a whole library of these split complementary. Let me make these a little bigger so we can see what we're doing. There are also analogous, split complementary, and all that sort of thing. And you can actually drag these color schemes into your swatches menu. And there are all sorts of different ones out there, and in fact you can even load them in from outside. So it's really a matter of just finding ones that you think go with the pattern you've got, and applying them. So again, I'll select this object, go to my Recolor Artwork menu, and then pick the ones that I think are going to work. Yeah, that's okay. Click OK. Now, finally, you might say, geez, I have recolor. Oops, I guess I need to recolor this one too. Let's go recolor that one. I don't remember which one I used. We'll try this one. Okay. You might say, geez, I want all these four patterns to match in terms of their location. What you can do is when you use the transform tool on the move option of the transform tool, you can actually tell it to, instead of transforming objects, transform patterns by whatever value you want. I don't remember if I copied these in exact distance, but apparently it works just right to copy it 5.25 inches. So anyway, this will move the pattern rather than the object. Here, let's repeat that operation, transform, move, and then move our pattern down. And the reason that you have to do this is when you move objects, the patterns don't always stay locked to the object. So you have to make sure that you get the pattern right where you want. This is particularly important if you're drawing an elevation, for example, and you want your pattern repeat to start at a certain location. You can use the move tool, but just move the pattern location. The other cool thing that you can do, and we don't need to do this for this particular part of the project, is you can transform the scale of the pattern as well. And of course, like a lot of these things, it's a matter of seeing whether or not you like it, and then either accepting it or not. Sometimes these sorts of things look pretty good, smaller. Sometimes they don't. Remember, these are small patterns. Probably for most of you, you won't actually make a decision until you've drawn, printed out the final version.